As words rise from the pages of a book into our consciousness, the world around us is expanded and refined. The mission of the Lafayette Library and Learning Center Foundation is simple yet powerful: to sustain the library as a community resource that offers enriching experiences for all ages. Thanks to the generous support of our donors, the Distinguished Speaker Series brings some of the most dynamic and compelling storytellers of our time to share their wisdom, inspirations, and insights with us. Their works tell of adventure, kinship, comfort, intrigue, and delight. Distinguished Speaker Series guests share tales of determination, activism, grief and forgiveness, contemplation, and the joys of childhood. If you value the Distinguished Speaker Series, please consider a gift to the Foundation so that we can continue to welcome exceptional authors and changemakers to our stage and into your lives. Thank you.
The Foundation supports library programs for all ages. In 2019, the Lafayette Library hosted close to 800 programs, all made possible thanks to the Foundation, its generous donors, and support from the Friends of the Lafayette Library. The Lafayette Library relies on the Foundation for more than 52% of its operating budget. To be specific, it's with donor support that the Foundation keeps the library doors open an extra 19 hours each week with the latest technology and materials. For our program today, I want to thank the Arinda Books for making the books available for purchase and generously donating a percentage to the Lafayette Library Foundation. Today, our Distinguished Speaker Series welcomes award-winning author Jess Walter. Jess has written 7 novels, a book of short stories, and 1 work of nonfiction. He began his writing career in 1987 as a reporter for his hometown newspaper, The Spokesman Review. He was a finalist for the 1992 Pulitzer Prize as part of a team covering the shootout and standoff at Ruby Ridge in northern Idaho. This became the subject of Walter's first book, Every Knee Shall Bow, in 1995. He's received numerous awards, including twice winning the Pacific Northwest Booksellers Award. He was a finalist for the LA Times Book Prize and the PEN USA Award in both fiction and nonfiction. His work has been selected 3 times for Best American Short Stories. His essays, stories, and journalism have appeared in numerous publications, including Harper's, Esquire, New York Times, and the Washington Post. His last novel, Beautiful Ruins, was a #1 New York Times bestseller and spent more than a year on the bestseller list. Today, he joins us to discuss his new novel, The Cold Millions, which was released just a few weeks ago, and that the San Francisco Chronicle describes as his best novel. The Washington Post calls The Cold Millions one of the most captivating novels of the year. Jess has prepared a special introduction for The Cold Millions, so I'm not going to say any more about the book. I just want to remind you that if you'd like to ask questions, please use the Zoom Q&A feature to write your questions, and we'll try to answer all of them at the end. And now I'd like to welcome Jess Walter. Hi, Jess. Sorry about that strange introduction.
No problem at all. But I think we're in a little bit of trouble if I'm the tech savvy one. Still getting used to this new world of Zoom book tour. This is my This is my 9th book tour and by far the strangest, but in some ways I thought this was a great opportunity too. I love traveling to all different places, and Sarah, thank you so much for that great welcome. One of the places I've always loved to travel is to Northern California, to Orinda Bookstore, and now to the Lafayette Library. So great to be here, to have my Northern California publicist, Judy Kirkpatrick, and my sister Christy watching too. Feels like a home game almost. So thank you, everyone. Because I couldn't go out on book tour and go to some of my favorite places, one thing I thought would be great, because this is a book set so profoundly and completely in my hometown of Spokane, Washington, I thought rather than going those places, maybe I can bring Spokane with me on book tour. So I grabbed a filmmaker friend and we made this very short Ken Burnsian light video that I want to show now that sort of sets up the novel, and then I'll talk about it a little bit, and then Sarah and I will have a conversation and hopefully take some questions from all of you. So with that, I think Sarah can cue up the video.
I've always admired authors who create a fictional version of their real homes. The Albany of William Kennedy, Elena Ferrante's Naples, the Monterey Peninsula of John Steinbeck. Over the course of 9 books, I've ventured far away to New York and the Zero, Italy and Hollywood and beautiful ruins, but I always find myself coming back to Spokane. They woke on a ball field. Bums, tramps, hobos, stiffs. They floated in from mines and farms and log camps, filled every flop and boarding house, slept in parks and alleys, and on the night just past, this abandoned ball field. My new novel, The Cold Millions, begins here, Peaceful Valley, Spokane, Washington, 1909. The book mixes fiction and history in a way that's almost impressionistic, blending past events with present concerns. My first inspirations were these old postcards that I collect of my hometown from the early 1900s. Living in Spokane can feel like living among ghosts. Every day you walk in the turn of the 20th century. The buildings, the streets, the ground under your feet. This was a period I'd wanted to write about for years, the end of the last Gilded Age, when Spokane was only a few decades old, lurching from wild frontier town to modern city, doubling in size every 6 or 7 years to nearly the place it is now. Buildings that now house thriving coffee shops and brew pubs were once a mix of brothels and bars, banks and boarding houses, vaudeville theaters and flop houses for miners and farmers. Brutal cops and private detectives skulked downtown with rifles peeking out beneath their trench coats, and thousands of itinerant workers, hobos, came by train from all over looking for work. This is the postcard that first sparked my imagination. As a writer, you stare at something like this and you can't help but wonder about the details, the things that live behind the official history. The packed street cars, the casinos, the woman in white moving across the frame, a man walking down a side street. This is where the novelist steps in to ask, what are they all doing down there? The story I set out to tell was based on real events. The free speech riots of 1909 in Spokane, and the Wobblies, the industrial workers of the world, the first union to take women, freed slaves, Native Americans, anyone with a job could be a Wobbly. It's a story of social unrest, of police brutality, of deep inequality, of the ache of wanting a better world, issues that resonate today. The IWW was outlawed from speaking and organizing on the streets. In Spokane, Wobblies staged the first successful nonviolent protests in U.S. history, a model for civil rights leaders and other peaceful activists. Speeches dissolved into riots, police and private goons beat protesters, there were mass arrests, 500 people locked up, the jails so full they threw prisoners in an old high school. The Cold Millions is the story of Gig and Ride Dolan, adventuring, vagrant brothers who get swept up in this turbulent class warfare. It's also the story of two women they meet. Ursula the Great, who sings on a vaudeville stage with a live cougar, and the labor activist and suffragist Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, a courageous, pregnant 19-year-old who comes to Spokane to lead the fight for justice. My research involved books, academic papers, letters, hundreds of newspapers. But in Spokane, you can walk right through history, like walking through a neighborhood filled with the mansions of mining magnates. Or a simple clapboard house, seemingly unchanged in 110 years, where Spokane's police chief was shot to death through the window by an assassin. The ghosts are everywhere. Even though it's fiction, I began to think of this novel as a loose origin story for my hometown, connecting the place we are now to the place we were then. But it's also a kind of origin story for my own working class family. Both of my grandfathers were itinerant workers in the West who found their way to Eastern Washington a generation later. My dad was a steelworker and union leader for 40 years. It's the truth of both history and historical fiction, I think, that the deeper you look into the past, the more you find yourself encountering the present moment. I know that was the case with the Cold Millions. These themes, the nature of progress, our endless struggle for social equality, they churn at the heart of this novel the way the Spokane River cuts through my western city, unceasing and inevitable, carving a path through time and stone to the ocean. Thank you for visiting my town. I hope you enjoy the Cold Millions.
Are you just trying to make me feel better? Now we can't hear you.
Yeah. Sorry, everyone. We'll get this by the end. Thanks again for being here. I want to talk just real quickly about the origins of the story, and then, as I said, Sarah and I will talk. I don't know how many of you have read Richard Powers, who's been a favorite novelist of mine for years. But when I read something that he said about The Overstory, his recent Pulitzer Prize-winning book, and it struck me as so familiar and true to the way you write fiction. Someone asked him, do you ever get lost in the research? And he gave the greatest answer. He said, no, I get found in the research. And that is so true, especially with this novel, which really came about for me initially as a newspaper reporter and just digging through the morgue, looking at old stories and finding these stories from 1909 about a period in my city's history that I had no idea about. One of those moments in history that maybe doesn't fit the larger flow of the river, and so as a tributary you forget about. And that was the free speech riots of 1909 and Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, this she-devil of anarchy, as the New York Times once called her, who as a 19-year-old pregnant labor activist led this free speech movement in my hometown. I always thought what a great novel this would make. I'm, as a journalist, I think I'm so concerned with the current moment we live in. And I often feel like, for me, a story can't just be a great story, but has to connect in some other thematic and resonant way to the time when I'm living. For me, the way into this story was always income inequality. Growing up in a labor family and in a very middle class, lower middle class, working class family, the egalitarian dream of rising up in class and in America had always seemed like something to me that was profound and real. And watching over the last 40 years as income inequality grew in this country, as the middle class shrank, as the path out of generational poverty became harder and harder. I long to tell this sort of story that would almost be an idealistic look at the kinds of equality that I believed in growing up, that I felt like my family embodied. Especially in the last few years, you know, as the gap between the wealthy and the poor reached levels that it hadn't reached since the last Gilded Age. It had me thinking about the last Gilded Age, about the end of the 1800s and the first decade of the 20th century. And in Spokane, that's such a poignant time, because you live in that world, as you saw in that video. So many of the buildings, the bridges. Spokane is really a turn of the 20th century city. And even as I was working on the novel, even as we entered this pandemic and 40 million Americans lost their jobs and billionaires got wealthier by $637 billion, it just seemed like no matter what other political things we talked about, this was an issue that felt like it deserved attention. But I'm not someone who likes to be didactic about these things or to lecture, despite the fact that I can, as my kids will tell you, I can launch into a lecture now and again. I wanted this to be a story. I wanted this to be narrative. These are the sorts of stories that move me the most. And that's where my second impulse really came in, which was the idea of the Western. As a novelist, I find myself saying things, I'll never do this, I'll never do that. And for years, I said that I would never write anything approaching a Western. Being a writer in the West, you feel like people almost expect it. This is such trod ground. I even one time called the Western novel horse porn. But as I kept looking at this period, 1909, I was so fascinated by the way in which there were horses on the street at the same time as cars, that there were shootouts and brothels, but also the Olmsted brothers, designers of Central Park, were in Spokane designing the parks. And this pressure between a city rising out of its frontier moment into this more modern moment struck me as the kind of stuff that I love reading about in fiction. It almost felt to me like the TV show Deadwood, but with 100,000 people. The violent birth of civilization in the midst of this natural beauty. The other parallels that kept striking me to that moment and ours were economic. Spokane is this rush town. It's easy to think of Silicon Valley right now as the focus of all of this internet wealth, but think of the railroad. The railroad was the internet in 1909, in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. It was the place that it was what was connecting the entire world economically, culturally. And Spokane was where 7 main railroads came together before they sparked back out to British Columbia, to Seattle, to Portland, to San Francisco. It was really this terminus, and all of the timber and mining and agricultural wealth that collected in this place. And that was almost how you had this city that, where all these forces could come together. If I was writing a Western, I thought, what kind of Western would it be? And one of my favorites is The Stranger Comes to Town. But instead of Clint Eastwood riding into town, I thought, how wild if I were to write a story in which a 19-year-old pregnant labor activist is my Clint Eastwood character riding into town, challenging the forces of the city. I was also struck in another present moment by the activism of young people. I purposefully wrote about characters who were 23, Gig Dolan, 16, Ryan Dolan, and 19-year-old Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. These young people whose idealism is pure and passionate and drives them. To talk about the beginning of the labor movement is to not talk about the excesses of the Teamsters or, the failure of communism and autocratic and brutal regimes like the Soviet Union. It's to talk about the idealism of young people, of people for whom collectivism and sharing and everyone having an equal opportunity at the pie makes perfect sense. And as I was working on the novel, as I was writing in 1909 and immersed in this deep research, I found myself thinking about the world we live in now, thinking about the shooting survivors at Parkland High School and their insistence that there can be reasonable gun laws, and how you could look someone like that in the eye and just say, there's nothing we can do, when of course there's something we can do. Or the students who strike for climate change, for a reaction, for a governmental reaction to climate change, or the young people leading the Black Lives Matter protests this last summer. It felt to me like this way to talk about youthful idealism, and how often that front wave of idealism and activism might not be what affects the change, but those things change anyway. They change as the rest of the culture settles in behind that leading wave of activism. But all of that are reasons. They're all, what draws you to a story. They aren't the story themselves. And with this, when you're researching, when you're drawing parallels, when you're looking at 1909, at some point you always have to do what every novelist has to do, even Richard Powers, I imagine, which is to fire the entire research department and to rely on the fiction department. The fiction department that gets caught up in the lives of the characters, in Rye Dolan, who is a much more practical person who gets drawn into these things, doesn't necessarily think he belongs at the front of marches, wants only a better life for him and his brother, a house and a job. And Gig Dolan, who is an autodidact, self-taught, who's read 2/5 of War and Peace and considers it the greatest work of fiction ever, and who has read just enough to be dangerous. And Gurley Flynn, so driven by her idealism that her own personal life takes a back seat. You find yourself so drawn into those characters and into the language, into the world of Bindlestiffs and 19th century detectives working for the Pinkerton Agency, sheriffs and police chiefs, and a vaudeville singer who performs with a wild cougar. Throwing yourself into a novel that way is, I think, in many ways very much like reading a novel like that. You are so immersed in it that to leave that world sometimes feels like a lurch. You just want to keep living in it the whole time. And while it's easy to see why with Beautiful Ruins I wanted to live on the Italian Riviera, I think I was every bit as immersed in this world, in the world of 1909, and in its parallels to the world we're in now. So I hope you enjoy the novel. I hope if you have any questions, I'd sure love to answer them about any of the things in the film, or if you've read the book, anything now. Sarah was worried about giving spoilers, but I assured her that if you don't know the story, there's very little that we can talk about that you can't rediscover. So thanks again for having me, and I hope you enjoy the novel, and I'm looking forward to answering questions about it.
Thank you so much, Jess. First, I thought I would ask a question.
Sure.
And you were just talking about Rye, and it made me think of something that stuck out for me was the question of free will.
Yeah.
Which you mentioned several times. Did you feel like Rye had free will? I mean, some of the characters sort of struggle with whether or not there's actually such a thing as free will.
Yeah, there's a moment in the novel when he asks that very question. He wonders what choices he's made. And it's another thing that I think we like to imagine as being equal in America, the choices we make. And yet anyone who's lived in poverty knows that if your car breaks down, you have many choices. You can call AAA, you can have someone pick you up. If your car is the only transportation you have and you're going to lose your job, you have fewer choices. And so I think that realization for Rye is one of my favorites in the book. the surprises you find when you're writing a novel are the great joy of it. And one of the surprises for me was realizing I was writing Rye's coming of age, his dawning awareness of his own place in the world. And much of that is economic. He's sitting in the library of a wealthy baron, and the floor is heated by radiant heat, and he's sipping brandy, and he's surrounded by floor to ceiling books. And his understanding at that moment of the layers between him and Lem Brand, this other character, I think are the beginning of this dawning awareness. Yeah, he does have free will. He has, and I loved, yeah, one of the great surprises again was this idea that he's going to have a choice that's going to be very important. So he does, certainly, we all have free will, we all have choices, but it's another thing that is not doled out equally, I think he realizes.
Well, there's certainly, the era sort of gives you this oppressiveness, and the characters, it doesn't feel like they have free will. I mean, they don't have freedom of speech, and they don't have any way to get employment. So I thought that was really kind of an interesting aspect of it. I love your characters. All of the characters are so incredibly rich. I found myself at different times through the novel deciding that this one particular character was my favorite. I really liked Dell for a while, and then Ursula, and then of course by the end I'm cheering for Elizabeth because she's such a powerhouse.
Yeah, she's really irrepressible. And anyone who's interested in her, I hope you go read her autobiography and read biographies of her. You know, it's you look at what that would be like personally, but it's probably my favorite part of writing is to get into those characters. And I think it's sometimes like being a character actor. You don't know that these roles are going to be so rich and meaty. And having someone like Ursula, just, you know, I knew I was going to write about her character, but then when Ursula the Great just sort of marches up and says, you know, a woman owns nothing in this world, and what a lousy return on investment that is, you know. It makes you feel like you know them and you want to embody them.
Mm-hmm. And particularly Elizabeth, where did that character, I mean, I know she's based on a real person, but I'm just curious, how much is she based on a person, and how much of it was you kind of creating this really strong?
I mean, there's very little about her at this period. And so I read the autobiography, biographies, even some letters that I found in some other books. And, but there were a couple of moments that just really opened her up to me. And one was a moment with her mother. So her mother was already a great feminist. You know, years before women had the right to vote, she found the only female doctor in New York to deliver her children. And she raised her daughters with this empowerment that in the early 1900s was unheard of, and told them they should not feel restrained by the rest of the world, by the rigid rules that they lived in. And as I was reading her story and realizing she left home essentially at 15 and 16 to go west and start, you know, rallying labor and you know, helping the working man, I imagine how that would be for a parent. You know, to have raised your kid with this audacity and this strength, and then to have them use it that way, it would be heartbreaking. And then when you'd realize that about your parents, and, you know, right after this moment in Spokane, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn goes home to her mother, essentially. And so realizing that I was writing someone who was, you know, who would experience some real hardship, a difficult marriage, thrown in jail in Spokane, and that she's going to go home to her mother, it just gave me this insight into the character as both a child and a parent. You know, just how you know, how difficult that would be, and also how kind of heartbroken she would be by how hard the world is. And so when you have that insight into a character, you just try to use that to open them up. Much of what I have her say in the book comes from her actual speeches. Almost everything that is quoted about her in the newspaper is what was actually in those newspaper articles that I researched. And so it's very much a portrayal of her that fits within her own biography.
So one of the questions from Roy, and is also sort of one of mine, is because your characters are so strong and their voice to me was just so clear each time the character shifted. I also know the language, notice the language was very different. And so I'm wondering, and Roy is asking how you kind of go about that process, creating your characters. And I'm particularly interested in the language, the different slang and terminology that seems very much of that era.
Yeah, I want to read a little bit from one of those characters. It's interesting because they're often sort of just sketches when I first imagine them. Actors use this terminology of finding a hat. They're in the prop room and they look for what hat their character would wear. And I often think I approach characters that way. What's this thing about them? With Ursula the Great, there was this moment when I realized that she had a fondness for younger, attractive men, a weakness for beauty. And I was writing that scene, and her sister was lecturing her and telling her, this is, you have a man's lecherous eye, and it's going to lead to your ruin. And as I'm writing that, all of a sudden, Ursula just says, well, then let's get on with it. And in that moment, I feel like, oh, I know that character. And so it's often writing scenes that sometimes don't make their way into the book or become such small scenes. And so Ursula, her sort of, cool nature in the face of this flaw of what everyone else sees as a flaw, but I think for her is a kind of aesthetic triumph. And then other characters, it might be language. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Dell Dalveau, who is a retired Pinkerton detective. And so much of this 1909 novel for me was a richness of the language, falling in love with the words themselves. And because I'm writing about a detective, a British detective working in the United States in the early part of the 20th century, I realized he would have come of age 20, 30 years before. And that had me reading late 19th century British detective fiction and soaking in that language and just finding that language so rich that I almost started seeing Dell as a kind of missing link between the Western novel and the noir, between the detective novel. And so I wanted to write him with an almost, with a hard edge, almost like one of those early detectives. And so his first line, Spokane gave me the morbs, right blood blister of a town, 6-month millionaires and skunk hobos and none in between. Spokane, a gilded carriage passing by peasants bathing in the very river they shat in. From the very beginning, Dell and his morbs, reading that the word morbs was a kind of unease that people had. And anyone who's lived in the last 4 years, I don't need to tell you what the morbs feels like. 2020 was the morbs. And so just being able to rekindle that kind of language, and his, later he describes Spokane this way. He says, I couldn't believe how that syphilitic town had metastasized. Smoke seeped from 20,000 chimneys, pillars to an endless gray ceiling. The city was twice the size the last time I'd hated being there. A box of misery spilled over the whole river valley. And so sometimes it's language that informs those characters. And Dell, with his lob-cocked and batty-fanged, all these 19th century slang terms that I could sort of bring into this world, really opens up the character. but again, you don't really know them until you know what they want, you know their weakness. And knowing for me that Dell really just wanted to retire and go see his daughter in Lexington, Kentucky, and his grandson. And there's a key moment, these tiny little things with characters. When he's thinking about his grandson, he says he's 6 or 9. And that gap in you know, his grandson's age tells you everything you need to know about Dell as a grandpa.
I think
and as a human being.
I think it's really obvious that you made Spokane a character in the story as well. And one of the descriptions I like is similar to the one you just read, describing buildings as 3 stories of brick and optimism.
Yeah.
So we have a couple questions about Spokane, people wondering how it's changed and how it influenced you in the story. That's your hometown, correct?
Yeah, if you saw in the video, there's that one postcard of all those people on the street. And I would collect these old postcards, and I thought it must be a parade or something. And then I realized it was just a day. It was just a busy day, you know, Spokane looking like Fifth Avenue, you know, and so this really was a moment when the city was at its peak. And after that, it was a long, slow period. You know, Seattle and Spokane weren't that much different in size in 1909. Of course, Seattle goes on to be, you know, a metropolitan area of 5 million people. Spokane grows from a city of 110,000 to a city of about 220,000 over the next 100 years, in a metropolitan area of about 400,000 or 500,000. And so there was a real economic stagnation until about the last 10 or 15 years ago. 10 or 15 years, Spokane has really thrived. It's one of the really up and coming Northwest cities. But really through, you know, the 80s and 90s, 70s, 80s and 90s, when I was growing up and a young adult and a newspaper reporter there, you really felt like you were living in the shadows of this other period. In 1974, there was a World's Fair, an environmental World's Fair, way ahead of its time. And so that started this process of cleaning up the railroad land and the river, which had been used really as a sewer. And so from about 74 on, there's been 1974 on, there's been a new sort of civic feeling in the city. And really for the last 10 or 15 years, it's thriving like any other Northwest city. It's sort of taken the Portland route to cool with great restaurants. And but it was great making it a character and making it this place. And I feel about my city the way most people feel about their family. If you praise it too much, I will tell you how terrible it is. And if you criticize it, I will stand up for it, and we'll probably come to blows. And so I loved having a character like Dell who just hates it. And he's constantly being told by boosters that it has the largest theater stage in the world, which it did, and the largest beer hall and the largest clock tower. And there's another great surprising moment for me when he just can't take it anymore and punches a booster in the throat. That was sort of my feeling about Spokane. Most of the novel, I think, celebrates this place that a lot of people don't know about. But you can only take, like Dell, I can only take so much boosterism.
One of the things that stood out for me in your video that I think I mentioned that I caught the second time I watched it was the Dashiell Hammett next to Tolstoy, and Tolstoy's referenced a couple times. War and Peace plays an important role in the story. Do you want to touch a little bit on Dashiell Hammett? I thought it was really appropriate, that sort of Western meets film noir kind of feel to the story.
Yeah, and I really did feel that. Dashiell Hammett was a Pinkerton detective. A lot of people, I don't know if they know that or not, but he was stationed in Spokane, and he worked the labor, the labor unrest in Montana. His novel Red Harvest comes out of his period as a Spokane Pinkerton. And years later, he used to tell the story, which some historians discredit, that he was offered $5,000 to kill Frank Little, who is a character in the novel and really was murdered and his body dragged behind a car, and a warning to other wobblies put on his clothes. So Hammett really was here during this time, and yeah, to connect those, to connect the noir and the Western felt like, for me, for a novelist who loves to skate in and out of genre and to fuse genres almost like a jazz musician. I love bringing things together that we don't always think of. It felt like this great opportunity. And as for War and Peace, it's really one of my favorite novels, and and giving that love of that novel to Gig was a way for me to make him the sort of to have him aspire the way I aspire. All of my class aspiration came through the literary world, through books and libraries. And it is the one place that I feel that egalitarianism does exist. Everyone can get a library card. And one of the most moving moments in the book for me is when Rye, really the only two times he's treated decently as this indigent worker are by a man who sells him a pair of gloves, and I'm not sure he treats him decently because he sells him a very expensive pair of gloves, and by a librarian who gives him the rest of War and Peace, and really, I think, completes Rye's coming of age by having him read a book that shows what it's like to live within the tumult of history, and allows him, I think, to put his own feelings and his own beliefs in place, to return to that sense of free will, really.
Right. So we have several people that are interested in your writing process, how long it took you to write the book, kind of what your day is like as you're writing. Could you maybe touch on that for a little bit?
Yeah, I like to pretend that nobody's really caring what I do, and so sometimes novels take a little longer than, just because I like to sort of stew in them. This novel, as I said, I started thinking about as an idea years and years ago, back when I was at the newspaper. And I would collect newspaper clippings and ideas, and I would think about characters, and I might write a page of Ryan Dolan. I was working on at the same time I was working on Beautiful Ruins, I was making notes on this novel, but I really started it in earnest about 5 years ago. And a lot of that was research. I went to several libraries. The library at Washington State University had the Spokane Press, a little known Hearst newspaper that existed in Spokane. And so I went there and just immersed myself in all of those newspapers. And one of my favorite things that I think we're missing in the time of Google, when we can look any specific detail up, is to go looking for something you don't know what you're looking for. And to just sit in a library's reference room and just read through plat maps and newspaper advertisements, and and have all these things sort of soak into you. I spent probably a year doing that, while I would write little bits of characters. And then it was about 3 or 4 years, I would say, that were really concentrated on this novel, while I also wrote short stories and worked on movie scripts, and whittled away time doing all sorts of less productive things.
So one of our questions is if you have a favorite in terms of, do you prefer articles or short stories or books? Do you have any particular favorite?
I'm a novelist probably by nature. There's still nothing for me as fulfilling and thrilling as reading a great novel. But I also love short stories, and I love to read and write all of them. Someone asked about my day. I'm a 7-day-a-week, 364 days. I usually take Christmas off a year writer. But I don't force myself to work on any one thing. So I write short stories, novels. I just finished a book review for the New York Times. I'll write essays. I wrote an essay about my favorite dog recently. And so I it's a lot easier to work every day if you don't think of it as work. I take great inspiration from musicians who never say I'm going to work, they say I'm going to play. And so I sort of treat writing that way. I'm working on a book of short stories now, and so it's been fun to go back and read some of my old short stories and write a couple new ones and immerse myself in that. I love writing just about anything as long as I can lose myself in characters like in this book.
So another question is, if you have another historical fiction on the way, what's next?
Next, I tend to, when I finish something, I tend to want to do something very different. Again, just to challenge myself, to think of the idea of play. I want to play a different song. I want to get a different melody in my head. So next will be a book of short stories called Mr. Voice, which is, and then I want to write something contemporary. I think there's great humor in this book, but it's also very serious because of what's happening. So I want to write something funny and contemporary. I had started another novel before this one, or around the same time, about this couple, and so I'll probably go back to it. And I have a working title for it. I'm someone who hears spoonerisms, who reverses the first words of phrases. And I'm in a men's Shakespeare club, and we were reading The Merchant of Venice, and I heard The Virgin of Menace. And I thought, what a great noir title that would be. So the working title for this other novel is The Virgin of Menace. So hopefully you'll all see it in a couple of years.
So we do have a question. Someone is interested in knowing if there was a early experience that you might have had where you realized the power of words for you. And then the follow-up to that is, was there any kind of impetus that took you from journalism to fiction?
Yeah, it's funny. Growing up in a working class family, my siblings and I are first generation college students. And so it wasn't the biggest reading family, but I think our mom pushed us to read and read books to us when we were kids. And when I was a little kid, I got a stick in my left eye, and I think that made me less of a roughhouse outdoors kid and more of a sit inside in your eye patch and read books kid. Remember my mom and my aunts and my mom's friends reading to me and loving that. And then my sister and brother and I had a family magazine called Reader's Indigestion, sort of like Reader's Digest. And so I think we always loved telling stories. I knew by about middle school that I wanted to be a novelist. I just loved books. I loved reading. Treasure Island was my favorite book as a kid, and I wanted to write pirate stories. Later, when I wanted to write adult fiction, I was headed for that, but in college I majored in journalism. I was a young dad, and I needed a way to support a family, and I think journalism probably fit my working class roots better. It was a craft. It was something I could do, and I often liken it to another musical analogy to playing piano in a joint where you just get requests all the time, and you play on this jangly piano that hasn't been tuned, but you really get your chops. And I felt like journalism was a great place to get my chops. And I kept writing short stories and sending them out, but it wasn't really until my 30s that I was able to transition from writing nonfiction to writing fiction.
All right, well, that kind of does it for us with our questions. And I just want to thank you so much, Jess. I love the book. I thoroughly enjoyed it. It's fantastic. I highly recommend it. If those of you that have picked it up and maybe haven't read it yet, it's a perfect one to curl up with on these cold winter days that seem to be heading our way. And I hope you will come back. You have an open invitation, Jess, to come and visit us at the Lafayette Library for your next book anytime. As soon as the doors reopen, we'd love to have you here in person.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks everyone. Thanks for the great questions, and thanks for reading. It means a lot to us authors that in these busy times that you'll curl up with a good book. So thanks for making it mine.
Thank you, Jess.